Sometimes the best poems are already written, and sometimes pens are not the weapon used to write them. Like the wooden club brandished by the side of a Tunisian cop, thicker than a Louisville slugger with a grip that reeks of the scent which sweats from clinging to orders too tightly. It screams for the days of the old regime. With splintered teeth and a rotten tongue I stand and watch the policeman ride by on his motorcycle, bludgeon baton in his palms, and I know that my foreign passport is an immunity card here, but I wonder, how many stories will it leave on the flesh of his fellow Tunisians? Poems of resilience and struggle tattooed and beaten into the consciousness of a people. It's hard to make ink do that, and it's tough to think outside the bruise box and look Tunisia's future square in the face.
So Sacrificial Poets started back in 2006. I was a part of a youth team when I was 19 years old that was taken by a local English teacher named Michael Irwin at Chapel Hill High School. He took a team of youth to Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam Festival. It changed my life. Then we got involved in the adult poetry slam scene, and we started recruiting youth. And in 2008, it wasn't until a couple years later, because we didn't know what we were doing, that we started hosting open mics. And we'd have youth come out to the open mics and share their words. And eventually we raised enough money and enough funding and enough interest in the youth that we had our first youth team that we took to Brave New Voices International Competition, which was in DC that year. We were known as the Chapel Hill Slam Team. That was in 2006. One of the members of the 2006 Slam Team, the Chapel Hill Slam Team, Ira Yarmolenko, she was a close friend of mine and a poet, and she was murdered in May of 2008. She was a student at University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and it was a big hit for us, obviously, and for us. There's a double meaning in the word sacrificial poet. It's a double entendre. The sacrificial poet in a poetry slam is it's also known as the calibration poet. It's the poet that opens up the entire night. They're not a part of the poetry slam per se, but they are kind of the first poet that gives the judges, which are random judges in a poetry slam, the opportunity to score and practice scoring. They open up the night. That's why they're called the calibration poet. For us, she was the ultimate sacrificial poet, her life being the sacrifice and the things that she did while she was alive. So we changed the name of the team from the Chapel Hill Slam Team to the Sacrificial Poets.
The project we're doing right now is called Poetic Portraits of a Revolution, and this project was really the result of us working with sacrificial poets over the years and kind of wanting to push our boundaries as artists and really push the potential of this art form that is spoken word poetry. And so in 2011, Kane and myself wanted to continue that. And so we reached out to another local poet who we worked with a lot in the community, Mohammed Musa, who was also a Lebanese American and a native speaker of Arabic. And so he became a crucial additional artistic influence, but also as a translator. And so we were looking at different locations. Kane had a couple of connections in South Africa. We were thinking about the possibility of going to Afghanistan. And then December happened, and January and February, and kind of a slew of uprisings throughout North Africa and the Middle East. And it became very clear where we should go.
So there was a definitive moment where the first big protest happened in Egypt. It was June 28th, and it was more of a violent protest where there was tear gas and riot police, and it sparked. And we're watching it on our computers, just watching the news broadcasts and things, and we're watching it happening, and we're like, okay, this is the first opportunity we have to go to a protest. What do we do? We're actually put in the scenario that we have to make a decision, and we came to the conclusion like, yeah, there's risk involved, but we took many risks to get here.
When we were in Egypt, we were constantly bombarded with these suspicions and who are you and what are your papers. And Tunisia was different. In Tunisia, the biggest threat was the riot police. The police were the threat. And so we had a couple run-ins with police in Tunisia. You know, in Egypt, we were in these large protests, and the police are over there shooting tear gas and rubber bullets, and we're over here, and when the police start shooting, we run this way with the crowd. In Tunisia, the police were in a lot of different places at once. We walk away from a protest and they'd come up through another entryway to another square on motorcycles and come up with tear gas. And so the interim government that also had connections to the past regime and the police forces there in Tunisia were really trying to keep press out of the protests that were happening, keep people from seeing what was going on. So we ran into a lot of issues with undercover police and with riot police. And so a number of occasions where we almost lost our camera, we almost got arrested, and somehow we found a way, really thanks to some of the contacts that we had on the ground there, to make it out and keep our footage. So we were lucky.
We're Poetic Portraits of a Revolution, or PPR. So in March of 2011, as 4 young artists, we were deeply inspired by the movements that were happening in Egypt and in Tunisia. Will and Kane, after working with a local organization that inspired youth through spoken word poetry called Sacrificial Poets, decided to take this art form further and use it to document current events that were happening in real time.
Our goal was to really focus on the people. So much in the mainstream media, we see what I like to think of as these zoomed out images, right? These quick snap images of events. And we see these events happening, and we try to use these images of events to understand, or in many cases, misunderstand entire groups of people.
So often, all we rely on are facts and statistics and these narratives. And it's not to say that those are not important, but also that, especially when dealing with something like a revolution, you have to understand the emotions, you have to understand the passions, you have to understand the people. And art, spoken word poetry in particular, as a unique way of captivating that, of helping us understand the world around us.
We have found meaning in the tales of a protester named Muhammad, whose feet were force-fed a sniper's bullet as he crouched, trying to drown out the stomach grumblings with freedom songs he recalls lunch on the front line.
Where a man was passed a small loaf of bread and tore half of it for the person next to him, who did the same, like shreds of a better tomorrow passing between palms that can't quite read the future. Muhammad said that when the bread finally reached him, it was just a tiny piece, but he too tore it in half and shared it with the unknown man beside him. In Tahrir Square, you didn't always know your brother's name.
As a single tear down the cheek of a father into the graveyard of his jawline, like foreshadowing of his son's funeral the next morning. His voice quivered as he confessed with the smile struggling to form. There is no celebration as joyful as a martyr's funeral.
Whatever the reason for a bullet being shot, the emotions it triggers are often the same, and the residue it leaves behind are memories that might not go away. These are lessons I thought I knew. We interviewed a giant the other day. Not the type with a club the size of a dinosaur femur that only speaks in grunts.
In fact, it was the man who dared to question her right to speak that seemed unable to say much more than fee, fi, fo, fum while she ground his bones to make her point.
I can't imagine how Maroon Mbaraki must have felt in the first month without his 16-year-old son after he was killed by police. His memory lives on in the songs of those who stood by him in protest.
We left Egypt the other day with a newfound appreciation of living, breathing history, despite what the government, the army, and the media have to say. Thank you.
I guess one last thing I like to say is for all artists is I really believe, and I think all of us believe, in the idea of using art to challenge systems of oppression, using art to promote change, using art to spread stories about people, not just art for art's sake. If our art does not challenge those systems of oppression, if our art does not creatively engage with some of the issues of our time and our communities, then it is complicit with that oppression.